The cold came in through the walls like it had always lived there. Mara felt it before she opened her eyes, that particular bite that settled into the corners of the cabin overnight, working its way under the quilts and into her shoulders and the spaces between her fingers. It was the kind of cold that announced itself without ceremony. Montana in late October did not ask permission. It simply arrived. She lay still for a moment longer than usual. Something felt wrong. Not wrong the way a bad dream felt wrong, with its formless dread that dissolved in the morning light. This was a different quality of wrongness, specific, physical, like a missing tooth you kept probing with your tongue. The other side of the bed was empty. That by itself wasn't unusual. Evan sometimes rose before light to check the animals or to walk the fence line when something was eating at him. She had learned not to ask too many questions about his moods. 7 years of marriage had taught her that much. So she lay there a moment longer and listened for the sounds that meant he was somewhere in the cabin. The scrape of a boot heel on the plank floor, the metallic tap of the coffee pot being set on the stove, the low creak of the front door hinges. She heard none of those things. What she heard was silence, and 6 children breathing in the back room and the wind pressing itself flat against the cabin walls. Mara sat up. She was 31 years old, though she had not looked 31 in some time. The years on the frontier had a way of wearing a person down to something leaner and less decorative than what they'd started out as. Her dark hair, once kept in careful order, had long since surrendered to the practical solution of a single braid she replaited each morning without looking in a mirror. Her hands were rough. Her face was angular where it had once been softer. She did not think much about any of that. There was too much else to think about. She pulled on her wool stockings and her overskirt and her heaviest shawl and walked to the kitchen. The stove was cold. That was the first real sign. Evan always lit the stove when he woke. Not out of tenderness. She had stopped believing it was tenderness some years back, but out of habit, the way a man will do a thing simply because he has always done it. The cold stove sat there in the gray morning light, looking like an accusation. She looked around the kitchen. The coffee tin was still on the shelf. The bread she'd wrapped in cloth the night before was still on the counter. Both water buckets were in their place by the door. Everything was where it should have been, and yet the room felt subtly wrong, as if something had been removed so carefully that it took a moment to identify the gap. Then she saw the note. It was on the table, folded in half, weighted down by the salt cellar, a square of paper that looked entirely ordinary. She picked it up with the same hands that had kneaded bread the night before, the same hands that had braided Ada's hair and pulled a splinter from Jessie's thumb and carried water from the creek 40 times a week. She read it twice. Mara, I cannot go on with this life any longer. I have done my best, but there are too many mouths and not enough of anything else. I am leaving. Do not try to find me. E. She stood holding the paper for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then she put it down on the table and walked to the barn. The barn was empty. Not entirely empty. The 2 milk goats were still in their pen and the chickens were stirring in their corner, but the horse was gone. Dancer, the bay mare that had pulled their wagon from Missouri 3 years ago. Gone. She walked the length of the barn and back, and then she walked outside and around to the side of the property where they stored the wagon. The wagon was gone. She stood in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at the flat rectangle of compressed dirt where the wagon had sat for 3 years, and she tried to be systematic about what she knew. The horse was gone. The wagon was gone. She went back inside and opened the box under the floorboard where they kept what little cash money they had accumulated from last summer's trade in town, $42 and some coins. It had been there 2 weeks ago when she had counted it herself, empty. She closed the floorboard and sat down on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the cabinet and her legs out in front of her, and she looked at the ceiling. In the back room, one of the children stirred. She heard the creak of a bed frame, and then the soft, shuffling footsteps of a small person crossing a cold floor, and then 6-year-old Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, her brown hair standing up on one side of her head. "Mama," Clara said, in the way small children say it, not quite a question and not quite a statement. "I'm right here," Mara said. She did not get up off the floor immediately. She sat there another second, pressing her palms flat against the cold planks, feeling the solidity of the wood under her hands. Then she got up. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. It's too early." "Is Papa making breakfast?" "Not this morning," Mara said. "Go on. Clara went, trailing her blanket. Mara listened until she heard the springs of the bed settle again. Then she relit the stove with the last of the dry wood from beside the hearth and started heating water for oatmeal, because the children needed breakfast, and she needed time to think, and those were the two most immediate things she could manage. Check. Her oldest was Thomas, 14, and he was the first one she told. Not immediately. She waited until the younger children were occupied with their morning tasks, until she had sent Ada and Jessie and the twins, Henry and Ruth, out to feed the chickens and check the vegetable garden for anything the frost hadn't taken yet. Clara trailed after them the way she always did, attached to Ruth's heels like a shadow. Only Thomas stayed behind, with the instinct he'd developed in the past year for knowing when something was wrong. He was tall for his age, though still a boy in the face, that unfinished look that boys carry for a few years before something shifts, and they begin to look like themselves for the rest of their lives. He stood by the stove with his arms crossed and waited for her to speak. "Your father's gone," Mara said. She had decided on the walk from the barn that she would not soften it, not for Thomas. "He left last night, took the horse and the wagon and the money." Thomas stared at her. She watched something cross his face, first confusion, then a kind of sick comprehension, then something harder and older that she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror that morning. "He left us," Thomas said. Not a question. "Yes. All of us. Yes." He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor, then at the window. His jaw worked like he was chewing something difficult. Finally, he looked at her again. "What are we going to do?" "Figure it out," Mara said. "Same as always." He nodded. He did not cry, and she did not expect him to. What she had not expected was what he said next. "Did you know he was going to?" "No," she said. "Were you—" He stopped, tried again. "Were you surprised?" She thought about that honestly for a moment. She thought about the last 2 years, the slow withdrawal, the silences that had stretched longer and longer, the way Evan looked at the children sometimes, not with irritation or dislike, but with a kind of bafflement, as if he could not quite understand how they had come to occupy so much space in his life. She thought about the arguments that had stopped happening, which had somehow felt worse than the arguments themselves. "No," she said finally, "not entirely." Thomas nodded again, slowly. "Okay." "Okay," Mara agreed. It was not okay. Neither of them said that part. The first week was the worst kind of difficult, the kind that wears the mask of ordinary days. She went through the cabin with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory before a flood. What they had: 2 sacks of flour, most of a bag of dried beans, some cornmeal, a small quantity of salt pork, 2 jars of the tomatoes she'd put up in July, half a jar of apple butter, a small amount of sugar, 2 partial candles, 1 extra kerosene lamp, and half a bottle of kerosene. The vegetable garden had been hit twice by frost, and there was little left there. Some root vegetables not yet dead in the ground, a few onions she'd missed when harvesting. The 2 goats were producing less as the season shifted. The chickens were laying inconsistently. She did not write any of this down. She held it in her head and turned it over like an object she was trying to understand, trying to feel its weight against what she knew of winter in this country. What she knew was that it was not enough. She set snares in the low brush along the creek. She had done this before, years ago, before the children were old enough to need so much of her time. She was not a gifted trapper, but she knew the basics, the placement, the patience required, the necessity of checking the lines early before anything was ruined. She sent Thomas to check them each morning and was honest with him about what she needed. "If there's something in the trap, you don't come back to tell me first," she said. "You reset it, then you tell me." "I know, Mama. I mean it, Thomas. Every hour matters." "I said I know." He did know. That was the thing about Thomas. He had always understood more than she told him, which was both a relief and a weight she carried on his behalf. The first week, the snares came up empty. Second week, a rabbit. She boiled it with the last of the onions, and the children ate it without complaint because they were hungry enough not to be particular, and because she had not yet told them how bad things actually were. She told them their father was gone on a trading trip. She told herself it was temporary, that she would tell them the truth when she had some better version of it to offer. She woke at 3 in the morning sometimes and lay in the dark and did the arithmetic of what remained against what they would need. The numbers did not resolve into anything hopeful. She knew how to be frugal. She had been frugal for years, had stretched every dollar of their meager earnings until it was thin as paper. But frugal had a floor, and they were approaching it. She thought about going to town. Copper Ridge was 12 miles, and without a horse or wagon, that was a full day's walk in each direction. She could not leave the children for 2 days. She thought about sending Thomas, but 12 miles alone for a 14-year-old boy in that country with winter coming. She ran the calculation and kept arriving at the same answer. She thought about neighbors, but the nearest ones, the Garrity family, were 8 miles east, and she had never been close with them. She and Evan had kept mostly to themselves. That had been Evan's preference, and she had accommodated it the way she had accommodated most of his preferences, because accommodation was the grain of their life together. She was beginning to understand, lying there in the dark, how much of her life had been shaped around accommodating Evan Cole. That understanding came without drama. It arrived the way most important realizations arrive, quietly, in the middle of the night, between one breath and the next. Ada was 11, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubbornness, and she began to understand something was wrong by the end of the second week. She came into the kitchen one evening when Mara was stretching a pot of bean soup thinner than it should have been, adding more water, hoping the children would not notice the difference. "Mama," Ada said, and her voice had that particular quality it got when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "Where's Papa really?" Mara kept stirring the pot. "He went to trade," she said. "Thomas doesn't believe that. Thomas doesn't need to voice his opinions to the whole family." "He didn't say anything. I can just tell." Ada came to stand beside her, close enough that Mara could feel the warmth of her against the cold kitchen air. "Are we going to be okay?" Mara stirred the soup. It was thin, and it smelled mainly of salt and very little of anything else. "We're going to be okay," she said. It was the second lie she'd told her daughter that week. The first had been that the soup was good. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what to do." Mara looked at her. This serious-faced girl with her arms crossed the same way Thomas crossed his arms, some posture they'd developed independently to mean the same thing, and it caught at something in Mara's chest. "I need more wood brought in before dark," she said. "The corner stack is getting low. I'll get Jessie to help. Don't wake the twins. Let them sleep." "Okay." Ada started toward the door, then stopped. "Mama, we'll be okay." Mara did not answer. She watched her daughter go out into the cold afternoon, and she went back to stirring the thin soup, and she pressed her lips together until the feeling in her chest subsided enough to be functional. Okay, 3 weeks after Evan left, the second snare came up with a rabbit, and 2 days after that, one of the chickens stopped laying and looked sickly, and Mara made the decision to slaughter it. She had Thomas hold the bird while she did it. He did not look away, which she had not asked him to. The chicken made a brief sound and then was still, and Thomas set it down when she told him to and went to the pump to wash his hands without being asked. She roasted it that evening with the root vegetables she'd dug out of the garden. 3 shriveled carrots, 2 small turnips, the last of the potatoes. The smell of it cooking filled the cabin in a way that made the children look up from their tasks and go very still, the way people do when something they've been missing without realizing it is suddenly present. It was the best meal they'd had in 3 weeks. "Can we have chicken again tomorrow?" Henry asked. He was 8, and he asked questions with the unself-conscious frequency of someone who had not yet learned to monitor their own appetite. "We'll see," Mara said, which meant no, and which Henry accepted without pushing because he had learned that tone. "Are there more chickens that are sick?" Ruth asked. Ruth was 8 too, and she thought more carefully than her twin before she spoke. "2 of them are looking poorly," Mara said carefully. "Should we eat them before they get worse?" She looked at her 8-year-old daughter across the table and thought, not for the first time, that children on the frontier grew up in ways that children elsewhere did not. "That's a very sensible thought," she said. Ruth considered this seriously. "Or we could make them better." "We could try," Mara agreed. "Both ideas have merit." Clara, who had been quiet through most of dinner the way she often was, eating with great concentration, said, "Papa would know what to do." The table went quiet. Thomas looked at his plate. Ada looked at Mara. Jesse, who was 9 and had a gift for reading a room, occupied himself suddenly with rearranging the food on his plate. "Your father would," Mara said. which was not quite a lie, because Evan had known more about animals than she did, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise to a 6-year-old who asked simple questions. "Now finish your dinner, Clara." Clara finished her dinner. Mara finished hers. Afterward, she sat with the younger ones while Ada and Thomas cleaned the pot and the plates, and she braided Clara's hair for bed and read aloud from the one book of stories she'd brought from Missouri, her voice steady and warm, because whatever else was happening, the children needed the sound of her voice to be steady and warm. It was only after they were all asleep, after the last candle was out and the cabin was dark and the wind had picked up outside, pressing itself against the walls with renewed intention. It was only then that she let herself sit at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. She did not cry. She sat for a while in the dark, her hands pressed against her face, feeling the cold of the cabin and the weight of the situation laid out plainly in her mind without the softening of daylight and small tasks. The flour would last perhaps another 3 weeks at the rate they were using it. The beans, another 2. The cornmeal was nearly gone. The goats were giving less every day. She had shot nothing with the rifle because she had not yet seen anything worth the powder, and she had to be careful with the powder. The snares were producing 1 rabbit every week and a half on average. That was not enough. She thought about what it would mean for them to run out of food in January, with the snow deep and the cold at its worst, and 6 children who needed to eat. She picked her head up out of her hands. She went to the window and looked out at the dark and the faint glitter of starlight on the frost-covered ground. She was not a woman given to waiting for things to resolve themselves. She had learned across the years of this marriage and this life that things did not resolve themselves. They resolved through effort, through planning, through doing the next thing and the next thing after that, however unpleasant or humbling or frightening those things might be. She needed help. The word sat in her chest like a stone, because she did not like needing help, and she had never been good at asking for it. Evan had called it stubbornness. She supposed it was, but she also knew the difference between the stubbornness that was a character flaw and the stubbornness that was the only reason she'd survived the last 7 years, and she was not going to let one of them consume the other at the worst possible moment. She needed help, and she had to figure out where to get it. It was Jesse who first mentioned Copper Ridge Ranch. He came in one afternoon from a walk he'd taken along the east side of the property, his cheeks red and his breath fogging, with that particular expression he wore when he had been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was worth reporting. "There's smoke coming from Copper Ridge," he said, stomping the mud from his boots at the door. "There's always smoke coming from Copper Ridge," Mara said. She was at the table mending Thomas's coat, her needle moving in small, quick stitches. "A lot of smoke," Jesse said, "like they're running the forge. And I saw 2 riders out on the south field." So they have horses." He looked at her with his careful 9-year-old eyes. "And they probably have food. And it's a ranch, so they probably need workers sometimes." She set the coat down and looked at her son. "Where did you hear about Copper Ridge Ranch?" "Mr. Henley told Papa about it last spring when he came through. He said the man who owns it is fair." "You remember that?" Jesse shrugged. "I remember things." He did. She'd noticed it before. The way he absorbed conversations he wasn't supposed to be part of. The way he held information patiently until it became relevant. "The man's name is Hale," she said, half to herself, pulling up the memory. Evan had mentioned it, briefly. Something about a rancher who'd made something out of difficult land out east of them, who ran cattle and did some farming and apparently kept a larger operation than most in this part of the territory. She had not paid great attention at the time. She paid attention now. "We could go ask," Jesse said. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" She opened her mouth and closed it. The honest answer was that walking to Copper Ridge Ranch with 6 children to ask a stranger for work and food felt like the kind of thing you did when you had exhausted every other possibility, and she was not quite ready to admit she had exhausted every other possibility. The less honest answer was that she was afraid of what it meant, what it said about her, about where they'd arrived, about the life that Evan had left behind him like wreckage. "Let me think about it," she said. "Okay," said Jesse, and he went to put his coat on the hook and find his sister, and Mara sat at the table with the mending in her hands and thought about Copper Ridge Ranch and a man named Hale and what it meant to walk to a stranger's door and ask for something you needed desperately. What? She thought about it for 4 more days. In those 4 days, the temperature dropped sharply. She found one trap sprung and empty, the bait gone. The smaller of the two goats stopped producing milk entirely. She used the last of the salt pork to season a pot of bean soup that she stretched across 2 dinners. Thomas came in from checking the wood supply and told her quietly, out of the children's hearing, that they had maybe another 10 days of firewood if they were careful. After that, Mara asked, I can try cutting more, but the axe needs sharpening, and the wood we have to cut is all green. It won't burn well. She looked at her 14-year-old, at the set of his shoulders and the way he was trying to look like he was not afraid, and she made her decision. We'll go to Copper Ridge Ranch in the morning, she said. Thomas looked relieved in the way that people look relieved when someone else makes a hard call. They could see coming but couldn't make themselves. You think he'll help? I don't know, she said honestly. But we don't have the luxury of assuming he won't. She spent the rest of that evening brushing and replaiting her hair and making sure the children had clean faces and that she herself looked like a woman who had survived difficulty rather than one who was being consumed by it. She told the children they were going to pay a call on the neighboring rancher. She did not tell them why. Ada looked at her with understanding she didn't voice, and Thomas nodded, and the younger ones accepted it as simply another thing that was happening. She lay awake that night running through what she would say. She had no interest in performing desperation, but she also had no interest in pretending the situation was anything other than what it was. She would be honest. She would be clear about what she was offering. Her labor, her children's labor, where it was appropriate, her capability, her willingness to work hard. She would not beg. She thought about what she had, 2 hands and a working knowledge of what it took to keep things going. She thought about Thomas, serious and reliable. She thought about Ada, who could do the work of someone twice her age when she put her mind to it. She thought about all of them, and she thought, we are not nothing. We are not people who have nothing to offer. She believed that. She believed it the way she believed in the things she had learned to believe by proving them true, slowly and with difficulty and without the comfort of anyone confirming it for her. She fell asleep somewhere after midnight, with the cold settling into the cabin walls and the children breathing in the next room, and she slept without dreaming. They set out at first light. She dressed the children in everything warm they owned. Clara wore 2 pairs of stockings and Jessie's old scarf wrapped twice around her neck. The twins moved in the slow, solemn way they moved when they understood something was serious without knowing exactly what. Thomas carried the youngest when her short legs began to flag. Ada walked beside Mara and said very little. The road to Copper Ridge Ranch was not much of a road, more a track worn into the landscape by wheels and hooves over years, and it wound east through ground that was frozen hard and pale in the early morning light. Mara walked steadily and did not look back. The children followed. In the distance, smoke rose from somewhere beyond the low ridge, thin and straight in the still air. She watched it as she walked. Someone was up early, tending fires that were already burning. She did not know what she would find when she got there. She did not know what kind of man Dawson Hale was. Fair, Jesse had reported from a second-hand conversation he hadn't been meant to hear, but Fair covered a wide range of territory in her experience. She knew what she needed. She knew what she had to offer. She knew that she was going to walk up to a stranger's door with 6 children at her back and tell the truth about her situation, which was the most frightening thing she had done in a very long time. The smoke from Copper Ridge grew thicker as they walked. The sun was fully up by the time the ranch came into view, more substantial than she'd expected, several buildings arranged around a working yard, a long, low bunkhouse, a barn that was larger than most she'd seen in this part of the country, fenced pasture where cattle stood in the cold morning air, signs of a working operation, of something maintained and ongoing. The gate was open. She stopped at it and looked at the yard, and then she looked at her children. Clara on Thomas's back, Ada close at her side, Jesse watching everything with his quiet alertness, the twins holding each other's hands, and she thought, we are going to be okay. Not because she knew it was true, because she needed it to be. And she had learned that sometimes needing something to be true was the only way to make yourself move toward it. She straightened her spine. She walked through the gate. A man was crossing the yard when she entered it, tall, moving with the unhurried practicality of someone who had learned to conserve energy over a long working life. He wore a worn coat and a hat pulled down against the cold, and he was carrying something in one hand, a coil of rope or a piece of tack. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped too. They stood there in the cold morning, looking at each other across maybe 30 feet of frozen yard. He was older than she'd imagined, somewhere in his mid-40s maybe, weathered in the specific way of men who worked outdoors in hard country. His face gave nothing away immediately, which she noted as neither hostile nor encouraging. He simply looked at her, then at the children ranged behind her, and then back at her. "You've come a ways," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "About 12 miles, she said. "I'm Mara Whitlock. I have a homestead to the west. The Whitlock place." She paused. "I'm looking for work. For myself and for my oldest son when he's not needed at home. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a household, I know some animal care, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I need wages and I need—" She had decided she was going to say this plainly. "I need food. For my children. I have 6. She watched him take that in without changing his expression particularly. "6, he said. "Yes." He looked at the children again. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on him because she had decided she was going to hold her ground and not flinch from the directness of what she was asking. "Your husband," he said carefully. "He know you're here?" She met his eyes. "My husband is gone," she said. "He left 3 weeks ago. He took the wagon and the horse and the money. I am managing the homestead alone with my children, and we are not going to make it through the winter without help." She said it exactly like that. No performance, no softening, just the plain fact of it, laid out in the cold morning air between them. Dawson Hale was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was thinking, rather than the kind that meant he was uncomfortable. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's cold, and you've walked far. Let's talk properly." She breathed once, nodded. "Thank you," she said. He led them toward the house, and Mara Whitlock followed him with her 6 children at her back, her spine straight and her hands at her sides, walking toward whatever came next. The house was warmer than she expected. That was the first thing Mara noticed, not the size of it, though it was larger than her cabin, or the fact that it was clean in the functional, unsentimental way of a place maintained by someone who cared about order without caring about appearances. It was the warmth. Real warmth, from a stove that had been burning for hours, that had soaked into the walls and the floor and the air itself. Clara, still on Thomas's back, made a small, involuntary sound when they stepped through the door. Not quite a word, just a breath of relief that Mara felt in her own chest. Dawson Hale set the coil of tack on a hook by the door and pulled off his hat. Without it, he looked both older and more approachable. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and there were deep lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and the wind for years. He gestured toward the kitchen table without ceremony. "Sit down," he said. "All of you." The children filed in around the table with the careful quietness of people in an unfamiliar space. Clara slid off Thomas's back and pressed herself against Mara's side. Jesse was already looking at everything with his systematic attention. The twins held each other's hands under the table and said nothing. A woman appeared from somewhere in the back of the house, older than Mara, somewhere past 60, with a square face and gray hair pinned back severely and the expression of someone who had seen most things and formed firm opinions about all of them. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the assembled Whitlocks without visible surprise. "This is Mrs. Aldine," Dawson said. "She manages the household here." Mrs. Aldine looked at the children, then at Mara, then at Dawson. "I'll put the kettle on," she said, and turned back into the kitchen. It was not warmth exactly, but it was efficiency, and in that moment Mara would have taken efficiency over warmth without hesitation. Dawson pulled out a chair across from Mara and sat. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her with the same unhurried steadiness he'd shown in the yard. Not unfriendly, but not rushing toward friendliness either. He was the kind of man, she sensed, who arrived at his judgments through observation rather than instinct, and who was not in the habit of pretending he'd arrived at them before he had. "Tell me about your situation," he said. "The practical parts." She appreciated that. She told him. She went through it methodically. The homestead, the size of it, the state of the supplies, what she had in the cabin and what she'd exhausted, the state of the snares, the firewood, the animals they had left. She told him the amount of time she calculated they could sustain themselves without intervention. She did not exaggerate any of it, and she did not downplay any of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What work can you do?" he said. Specifically, cooking for a large group. I fed a family of 8 for 7 years on very little, which means I know how to manage provisions and I know how not to waste things. I can clean and manage a household. I have some knowledge of animal care, milking, basic illness, that sort of thing. I can do laundry, mending, whatever's needed. She paused. I learn fast when I need to. Can you ride? I haven't in some years. I could again. He nodded, slowly. I've got 8 hands working this ranch, plus Mrs. Aldine. That's a lot of mouths for a kitchen. Mrs. Aldine manages it, but she's been asking for help since last winter. He glanced toward where Mrs. Aldine had disappeared. She won't say so directly, but I've noticed. I would work hard, Mara said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the chance to work for what my children need. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like recognition. I know the difference, he said. Mrs. Aldine came back with tea. Actual tea, not the thin bark tea Mara had been making for weeks, and set it on the table with the efficient grace of someone who has performed the same action thousands of times. She also set down a plate of biscuits without comment. Clara reached for one immediately and then pulled her hand back and looked at Mara. Go ahead, Mara said. Clara took the biscuit. So did Henry and Ruth and Jessie. Thomas waited until the younger ones had taken theirs, and then took one himself, in the careful, self-denying way he'd developed over the last few weeks, the way he'd learned to eat less so the others could eat more. Mara saw Dawson notice this, though he said nothing. The children, Dawson said. How old are they? Thomas is 14, Ada 11, Jessie 9. The twins, Henry and Ruth, are 8, Clara is 6. They do chores? All of them. Thomas does the heavy work alongside me. Ada manages most of the cooking when I'm occupied elsewhere. Jessie is responsible and learns quickly. The twins can be useful when they're directed. Even Clara does small tasks. I'm not looking to put children to work, he said, with a directness that suggested this was important to him. I'm not asking you to, Mara said. I'm telling you they're not a burden to be managed. They work because we all work. That's how we've survived. He looked at her for a moment. Fair enough. Mrs. Aldine had settled herself at the far end of the kitchen counter and was doing something with a bowl and a cloth, with the particular posture of someone who is listening carefully while appearing not to. I have a bunkhouse, Dawson said. The hands sleep there. There's a room in the main house that's been unused since my sister left 2 years ago. It has 2 beds. It wouldn't fit 6 children comfortably, but it's warm and it's dry. He paused. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Aldine and I eat in here. If you were working the house kitchen, you'd eat here too. The children would eat with you. Mara sat very still. You're offering us the room? She said. I'm telling you it exists. I'm telling you what work I need done and what I can offer in return. Wages, a room, and meals. That's the arrangement. He said it plainly, without preamble. I'm not offering it because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because I need a second person in that kitchen and you need work, and that's a straightforward exchange. She understood suddenly why the second-hand description she'd gotten from Jessie had called this man fair. When would you need me to start? She said. Tomorrow wouldn't be unreasonable. She thought about the cabin, the cold stove, the dwindling flour, the thin soup. She thought about Thomas coming in from the woodpile with his quiet arithmetic of how many days they had left. We'd need to go back today and collect what we have, she said. Thomas and I. We'd be back by tomorrow morning. He nodded. I'll have one of the hands go with you. Easier with an extra set of arms. Thank you. He pushed his chair back and stood. I'll find Pete. He's not doing much that can't wait. He went out the door and Mara sat at the table with her children and the tea and the plate of biscuits, and for a moment none of them said anything. Ada reached across and touched Mara's arm. A light, brief touch, then gone. Thomas was looking at the table. Clara was on her second biscuit. Are we going to live here? Clara asked, with the simple, direct curiosity of someone for whom this was primarily a matter of information. For a while, Mara said. Is it warmer than home? Yes. Clara considered this. Okay, she said, and finished her biscuit. Ito. Pete turned out to be a young man of about 20, with a wide, honest face and the particular combination of physical ease and social awkwardness that characterized a certain kind of ranch hand, completely comfortable on a horse or hauling freight, somewhat uncertain in the presence of a woman and 6 children. He said very little on the walk back to the Whitlock homestead, and what he said was mostly directed at Thomas, who was close to his own comfort zone, and the two of them walked ahead of the group discussing things Mara couldn't quite hear over the wind. She let them. The cabin, when she walked into it for what she knew would likely be one of the last times, looked smaller than it had that morning. That was not unusual. Spaces contracted and expanded depending on what you carried when you entered them. She stood in the kitchen and made herself look at it practically rather than sentimentally. There had not been much that was good here, and she should not pretend otherwise because she was leaving. Take everything we can carry, she told Thomas and Ada. Anything useful, the tools, the remaining food, all of it, my sewing things, the book. The furniture? Thomas said. Leave it. We can't carry it, and we'd need the wagon for that anyway. She paused. Take your father's axe. We'll need an axe. No one commented on the phrasing. She hadn't meant anything by it, or rather she had meant something by it, and she didn't need to explain what. They packed efficiently, without sentimentality, which was a thing Mara had always been better at than most people. The food went into a sack, pitiful in its lightness when she lifted it. The tools. The book of stories, wrapped in cloth. Her sewing basket. The quilts from the beds. The children's extra clothing. She went through the rooms once more to make sure she hadn't left anything that mattered, and she found herself standing in the doorway of the bedroom she had shared with Evan for 3 years. She stood there for a moment. She was not grieving the bedroom or the marriage or the man. Not exactly. She was grieving something harder to name. Something like the version of the future she'd once believed was possible. The version where the struggle was shared and the outcome was something you could point to with a sense of joint accomplishment. That version had not existed for a long time, if it ever had. She had known that, but knowing something and releasing it were separate acts, and they did not always happen at the same time. She pulled the door closed and went back to the kitchen. Pete loaded what they had into his arms and into Thomas's without making any remark about how little it was, which Mara appreciated more than she could have easily expressed. They walked back to Copper Ridge Ranch in the gray afternoon light, arriving just as the sun was dropping below the ridge, and the yard was filling with the returning sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Horses coming in, a door closing somewhere, the smell of wood smoke and something cooking drifting from the cookhouse. Mrs. Aldine showed them the room. It was not large, but it had 2 solid beds and a window and a small wood stove in the corner, and someone had made it up. Mara suspected Mrs. Aldine herself, though she did not ask, with clean quilts and extra blankets stacked at the foot of each bed. The twins immediately went to the window and looked out at the yard with the focused attention of people cataloging a new landscape. Clara climbed onto the nearest bed and bounced once, experimentally. "This is nicer than our room at home," she announced. "Clara," Ada said, "it's true." "That doesn't mean you have to say it." "Why not?" Mara did not intervene in this. She set her sewing basket down on the floor beside the door and looked around the room and breathed once, slowly. "Unpack your things," she said. "We'll eat in an hour." But she was up before anyone else the following morning. That was not unusual. She had been the first one up for years because the household ran on her starting it. But there was a different quality to waking in an unfamiliar room, in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that smelled of someone else's years of living. She lay still for a few minutes and listened to the sounds of a larger, more active place. Someone moving in another part of the house, the distant noise of animals, a door. She dressed and went to the kitchen. Mrs. Aldine was already there. They regarded each other across the kitchen for a moment with the careful assessment of 2 people who have been told they will be working in close proximity and have not yet determined whether this will be manageable. "Coffee's made," Mrs. Aldine said. "Thank you." Mara poured herself a cup and stood at the counter and looked at the kitchen, the layout, the provisions, the size of the stove. "Tell me what needs doing this morning." Mrs. Aldine looked at her. "Breakfast for 12, hands eat at 6. Mr. Hale eats after." "What do you have to work with?" It was the right question, apparently. Something in Mrs. Aldine's expression eased very slightly. the almost imperceptible relaxation of someone who has been doing everything themselves and has been half expecting to have to explain why to someone who would criticize it. Eggs, bacon, cornmeal, plenty of flour. We have a smokehouse out back. The bacon's from last fall's slaughter, still good. Dried beans for the noon meal. Biscuits with the bacon? Mara said. That's what I usually make. Then let's do that. How do you take the cornmeal? Porridge or fried cakes? Fried cakes. Men don't eat porridge, if they can avoid it. No, Mara agreed. They don't. They worked beside each other without much conversation, and it was the working that did it. The shared and efficient occupation of a kitchen space, the unspoken negotiation of who handled which task, the gradual calibration of how each person moved. Mrs. Aldine was faster than Mara had expected and had less patience for anything done halfway, which suited Mara perfectly. Mara had a better instinct for quantity and seasoning, which Mrs. Aldine did not resist acknowledging by the simple method of not commenting when Mara adjusted something. By the time the hands came in for breakfast, they had produced a meal that was plain, hot, substantial, and ready on time. The hands, 8 of them, ranging from a boy not much older than Thomas to a weathered man in his 50s, ate with the focused efficiency of people who worked hard and regarded mealtimes primarily as fuel. A few of them glanced at Mara with curiosity. None of them said anything directly to her, which was fine. There would be time for that. Dawson Hale came in after the hands had gone, sat at the kitchen table, poured his own coffee, and ate without comment until he was nearly finished. Good biscuits, he said then. Mrs. Aldine's recipe, Mara said. He glanced at Mrs. Aldine, who was washing the pan, and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Your children get fed, he said. Before the hands. I had them eat early. He nodded. He finished his coffee and stood. I'll be on the south fence line most of the morning. If anything needs addressing, Pete or Garrett will be around the yard. We'll be fine, Mara said. He picked up his hat, paused at the door. Mrs. Aldine, he said, if she needs anything from the storeroom, she gets it. I know that, Mrs. Aldine said. He went out. Mara dried a pan and set it on the shelf and thought about the specific weight of that statement. If she needs anything, she gets it, and what it meant in practical terms, and did not let herself get sentimental about it, because sentimentality was not what this situation called for. The first 2 weeks at Copper Ridge Ranch were a study in the particular effort of adjusting to something new while managing people who were also adjusting. The work was hard and unrelenting, and Mara was grateful for it. Grateful in the way you're grateful for cold water on a fever, for the simple relief of having a problem you know how to solve. The kitchen was her domain, and she understood it immediately. She understood what 12 working people needed to eat and when they needed to eat it, and she understood how to manage a larder and a stovepipe and a daily schedule with the kind of deep, unthinking competence that comes from years of practice rather than any particular gift. The children were another matter. Thomas slotted in most naturally. Dawson had put him to work in the barn with a quiet instruction to Pete to find him things to do. And Thomas was the kind of boy who needed to be doing something, or he grew difficult and withdrawn. Within a week, he was rising with the hands and coming in smelling of horse and hay with a look on his face that was not quite happiness, but was something in the direction of it. Ada took on a role in the kitchen that had not been explicitly assigned, but which she assumed with such natural authority that no one questioned it. She helped Mara with the noon meal and the evening meal, and managed the younger children's meals with the calm, efficient manner of someone who had been doing it for years, because she had been. Jesse explored the ranch with the systematic attention he brought to everything, and within a week he knew where most things were and how they worked and had developed opinions about most of them. He reported his findings to Mara in the evenings, casually, as if he were doing her a small courtesy. The twins were harder. Henry missed his father. He had not said so directly. He was a boy who expressed himself through behavior rather than words. But it came out in the resistance, the moments of digging in over small things. The way he looked at Dawson Hale when the man crossed the yard and looked away quickly when Dawson glanced in his direction. Ruth handled it differently, by being very good, by following every rule carefully, by watching to determine what was expected and then meeting it before she was asked. Mara noticed both of these things and did not push either of them. There was a time for addressing what was happening inside the children, And it was not while they were still finding their footing in an unfamiliar place. She let them take the time they needed. Clara, being 6, had the flexibility of someone whose world was primarily made up of immediate things: warmth, food, the proximity of her mother, and the interesting presence of 8 working men who were largely gentle with her in the uncomplicated way that grown men who live rough lives are often gentle with very small children. She had attached herself in particular to an older hand named Garrett, who was somewhere in his 50s and said almost nothing to anyone, but who could be found most evenings sitting on the bunkhouse step, and who seemed entirely unbothered by a 6-year-old settling herself beside him and talking steadily about whatever was on her mind. Mara watched this from the kitchen window one evening and felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. She encountered Dawson Hale at the edges of the day, mostly. He was in the kitchen at breakfast and sometimes the evening meal, and occasionally she passed him in the yard or caught him at the barn when she was collecting eggs or checking on the milk cow they kept near the house. He was not a man who used words unnecessarily, which meant that the words he did use tended to be direct and worth paying attention to. He asked her one evening, about 10 days into their arrangement, whether the room was warm enough. They were the only two in the kitchen. She was finishing the cleanup from the evening meal, and he had come in for a second cup of coffee, which she had noticed he sometimes did when there was something on his mind. "It's warm enough," she said. "The stove in there has a temperamental damper. If it gets too cold, you need to adjust it to the left, not the right. Pete can show Thomas how. I'll tell him." He poured his coffee, stayed at the counter rather than going to the table. "Your son," he said. "Thomas. He's a good worker." She dried the pan she was holding. "Yes. Not asking me to confirm it, just telling you." He paused. "He doesn't talk much. He's like that when he's thinking about something. He goes quiet." "What's he thinking about?" "I'd guess his father," she said. She said it plainly because she was not going to pretend otherwise. "He's 14. He's angry. He doesn't know what to do with it." Dawson was quiet for a moment. "That's not an unusual thing for a boy his age." "No, he'll work through it. You know that?" She looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I tell him what I can, and the rest—" She paused, searching for the right way to say it. "The rest he'll have to find himself. That's just how it works." Dawson nodded. He looked into his coffee cup, then out the window at the dark yard. "My father left when I was 17, he said. "Not the same thing, but it leaves a mark." She did not respond immediately because she understood this was not an invitation to respond, but an offering, a small specific thing he was putting on the table so she would know it was there. "Yes," she said finally. "It does." He finished his coffee, set the cup down. "Good night, Mrs. Whitlock." "Good night, Mr. Hale." He went. She finished the cleaning in the empty kitchen, and she thought about the particular and strange nature of learning someone you did not know, the way it happened sideways, through small things, through what a person chose to say and when they chose to say it, and the shape of what they left unsaid. It was Mrs. Aldine who told her about the ranch's history, not deliberately. She was not a woman who told things deliberately that were not hers to tell. But over the course of 2 weeks in close quarters in a kitchen, certain things emerged, the way things emerge when two people work side by side, and the silence between tasks becomes conversation by degrees. Dawson Hale had built Copper Ridge from a quarter of its current size. He had bought the original land, not much, and not good, with money he'd spent 8 years saving while working someone else's ranch in Wyoming. He had worked it alone for 2 years before he had enough to hire the first hand. He had expanded 3 times since then, through a combination of hard work, careful money, and the particular kind of stubbornness that some people mistake for optimism. He had been married once. His wife had died of fever 4 years ago. No children. Mrs. Aldine told this last part in the same tone she used to tell everything, flat and factual. But she looked at the pan she was drying when she said it rather than at Mara, which was the only concession she made to the weight of it. "He doesn't talk about it," she said. "I wouldn't expect him to," Mara said. "No." Mrs. Aldine hung the pan up. "He's not a man who talks about things that hurt him. He just works harder for a while, and then it seems to pass." Mara thought about the particular loneliness of that, and then she thought that she probably had no standing to call it lonely. because she did not know the man well enough to determine whether it was loneliness or simply the way he was built. "He's a fair employer," she said. "He's fair in general," Mrs. Aldine said, and there was something in the word general that carried several years' worth of observation behind it. The trouble with Henry came to a head on a Thursday afternoon in the third week. He had been given the task, a small one, entirely appropriate, of helping Pete sort hardware in the barn, the kind of simple organizational work that did not require skill, only patience. Pete had apparently shown him once what to do and left him to it. An hour later, Pete returned to find the work undone and Henry nowhere visible. He found him eventually. Mara found this out through Jesse, who had seen the whole thing, sitting behind the barn in the cold, not crying but close to it, with his knees up and his back against the wall, and his jaw set in the way that meant he was holding something in hard. Pete, to his credit, had not made it into an incident. He had simply sat down beside Henry and waited, and eventually Henry had come back inside. But Mara found out about it, and that evening she went to find her son. He was in the room, on the bed, looking at the ceiling. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not say anything immediately. "Don't," Henry said. "Don't what?" "Don't give me the talk about working hard and being grateful. I wasn't going to." He looked at her sideways. "What were you going to say?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I was going to see what came out." He went back to looking at the ceiling. "I hate it here." "I know. I want to go home." "I know. The cabin is better than this." "The cabin was cold and almost out of food," she said quietly, "and you know that." He was quiet. His jaw was still working. "Do you miss your father?" she said. "No." Very fast. Too fast. "Henry." "I don't," he said, but his voice had gone uncertain. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He stiffened, and then, after a moment, didn't. "You can miss him and be angry at him at the same time," she said. "You don't have to pick one." He didn't say anything. "I know this isn't what any of us wanted," she said. "It isn't what I wanted either, but we are here and it's warm and there is food, and those things matter right now. They matter a lot. What if we have to stay here forever?" "We don't have to worry about forever," she said. "We just have to manage today." He turned his head and looked at her. He had Evan's coloring, the fair hair, the blue eyes, and sometimes it caught her off guard, the way her children carried traces of the man who had left them without ceremony, how those traces were only and entirely themselves, not his to take back. "Okay," Henry said. It was not resolution, it was just the end of the conversation, which was enough for now. She stayed sitting on the edge of the bed until his breathing evened out and he fell asleep, which happened faster than she expected because he was 8 years old and exhausted and had been holding that afternoon behind the barn inside him all day. She sat there in the dark for a while after and thought about her children, the specific and different weight of each of them, the way she carried all 6 of them with her all the time, not as a burden but as a fact of her existence, as the central and defining fact of it. And she thought that whatever else had gone wrong in the last 7 years, whatever she had failed at or misjudged or been too slow or too stubborn about, she had done this right. She had kept them fed and warm and honest about the world and capable of surviving it. She had done that. She got up quietly and went back to the kitchen, where there were still things that needed doing before the morning, and she did them. The month turned without announcement. One morning Mara woke and the quality of the cold had changed. Still brutal, still the kind that made the air hurt going in, but different from the desperate cold of November, which had carried with it the specific terror of inadequacy. This was January cold, settled and committed, and there was a difference between cold you could not survive and cold you were surviving. She felt it before she was fully awake. She lay there a moment and took inventory of the room. Clara's breathing from the bed against the far wall where she'd ended up sleeping between Ruth and Ada, Thomas's coat hanging on the hook by the door, the sound of someone in the yard already moving. And then she got up and started the day. The rhythm of Copper Ridge had become her rhythm, the way rhythms do when you live inside them long enough. She knew the sounds of the house at every hour. She knew which floorboard by the kitchen door creaked and could step around it in the dark without thinking. She knew that Pete came in for his coffee before the other hands, that the older man Garrett never spoke before his second cup. that the youngest hand, a boy named Cal, 16, who had arrived at the ranch the previous spring from somewhere he didn't like to talk about, ate everything put in front of him with a concentration that reminded her of her own children in the first weeks, when they'd still been making up for what they'd gone without. She knew that Dawson Hale took his coffee black and his breakfast plain and never complimented the food directly, but would sometimes say good morning with a quality to it that meant more than the words. These were small things. She collected them the way you collect small things in a new place. Not because you're cataloging, but because you're learning, and learning requires paying attention, and she had always been good at paying attention. What she was less good at was knowing what to do with what she learned. What? Thomas turned 15 in the second week of January. She had not forgotten. She had never once in 14 years forgotten a birthday, had made something of each one even in the worst years, even when making something of it meant a single piece of hard candy and a story told after dinner with everyone gathered close. She told Mrs. Aldine 2 days before, not asking permission exactly, but letting her know. "I want to make a cake," Mara said. "I'll use my own portion of the sugar." Mrs. Aldine looked at her for a moment. "Use the ranch's sugar. It's a birthday." "I don't want to presume." "You've been here 6 weeks and you've saved me 6 years of work," Mrs. Aldine said, in the tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than a compliment. "Use the sugar." She made a plain butter cake with dried apple between the layers, which was the best she could do in January, and she put it on the table that evening after the hands had eaten. Thomas came in not knowing and stopped in the doorway when he saw it. He looked at the cake. He looked at his mother. Something crossed his face that he covered quickly with the instinctive composure he'd been developing over the last several months. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," Mara said. The younger children were already at the table. Even Mrs. Aldine had stayed in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her arms crossed and her expression neutral. Dawson was there too. Mara had mentioned it to him that morning, not as an invitation, only as information, but he had come in from the yard at the right time and not made anything of it. Thomas sat down. Mara cut the cake and distributed it. Clara got a piece that was slightly too large and ate it with the focused devotion she brought to anything that was sweet. The twins ate theirs side by side and did not speak because their mouths were full. Jesse ate his slowly, in small bites, making it last. Henry looked at his piece for a moment before he ate it, and then he looked at Thomas. "Happy birthday," he said. It came out rough and a little reluctant, but it came out. Thomas nodded. "Thanks." It was the most Henry had said directly to Thomas in 3 weeks, because something had shifted between them. Not badly, just the way things sometimes shifted between brothers when one of them was struggling and the other didn't know how to be close to struggling. Mara had not tried to fix it because it was not hers to fix. She had simply watched and waited and trusted that they would find their way back. Dawson had a piece of cake. He ate it without comment. When he was done, he looked at Thomas across the table. "Your mother says you've been doing good work in the barn." Thomas looked surprised, not at the statement, but at being addressed directly. He recovered quickly. "I try to pull my weight," he said. "You do more than that." Dawson said it without elaboration, the way he said everything that mattered, cleanly, without build-up, and then he moved on. "Pete's going to need help with the fence repair on the north line next week. It's hard work in this cold. You're welcome to come if you want the work." Thomas straightened slightly. It was barely perceptible, but Mara caught it. "Yes," he said. "I'd want to." "Good." Dawson pushed back from the table. "Good cake," he said, which was the closest he generally came to superlatives, and which made Clara look up from her plate with an expression of complete satisfaction, as if she had made the cake herself. The thing Mara had not expected about Copper Ridge, the thing that surprised her in a way that genuine surprises were rare by her age, was how much she came to value the work itself. Not simply as survival, not simply as the thing that kept her children fed and warm, but as its own thing. The kitchen was real. The work in it was real. The result of it was tangible 3 times a day. She had always known how to do this work, but she had done it for 7 years, in conditions that stripped it of most of its satisfaction. Always too little to work with. Always the arithmetic of stretching and rationing. Always the weight of it being barely sufficient rather than genuinely good. Here, with the ranch's larder behind her, she could cook well. She could produce meals that were not just fuel, but were actually good. and the effect of this on the people who ate them was visible, and she had not realized until now how much she had missed the simple satisfaction of making something good and watching it be received as such. Mrs. Aldine noticed. "You cook like someone who used to do it better than this," she said one afternoon, about 7 weeks in. They were preparing the evening meal together, and it was said without particular emphasis, almost as an aside, but Mrs. Aldine did not make asides without purpose. Mara thought about that. "I used to cook for pleasure when I was young, before I was married." "What changed?" "Everything got smaller," Mara said. "Resources mostly, but also the way you cook changes when you're cooking out of necessity. Something goes out of it." "And now?" Mara was quiet a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in the spring." Mrs. Aldine made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, and turned back to the stove. The bond between the children and the ranch grew in the way that bonds with places grow, gradually and differently for each of them. Jesse had developed a specific fascination with the cattle operation, and Dawson had apparently noticed because one morning he found Jesse by the fence of the near pasture, watching the herd in the cold with his hands shoved in his coat pockets, and had stopped beside him and answered the questions Jesse immediately began asking with the patient attention of someone who respected a genuinely curious person regardless of age. Mara heard about this from Pete, who had witnessed it and reported it to her with a kind of quiet approval, as if he wanted her to know without wanting to make too much of it. Ruth had attached herself to Mrs. Aldine in the way that certain methodical children attach to certain methodical adults, recognizing something familiar in the approach to tasks. The careful doing of things in order, the lack of unnecessary movement, the satisfaction of completion. Mrs. Aldine did not encourage this with warmth, exactly, but she did not discourage it either, and she had begun, Mara noticed, to explain what she was doing while she was doing it, in the low, even tone of someone who had decided, without saying so, that teaching was worth the effort. Henry was still working through something. He was better. The worst of the resistance had eased. But he was still guarded, still prone to going quiet in ways that could tip toward withdrawal if left alone too long. Mara tried to reach him in the ways that worked, practical things, direct questions, not too much gentleness, which he distrusted. It was slow work, and she accepted that. Clara remained entirely herself. She had by now achieved a kind of celebrity among the ranch hands that she was completely unaware of, and would not have understood if explained to her. This happened sometimes with small children who had no self-consciousness about their own presence. They simply existed with complete commitment to whatever they were doing. And adults in proximity found this either exhausting or inexplicably charming, and the Copper Ridge hands were, in this as in some other ways, unexpectedly gentle men. Garrett remained her primary audience. He had not, in 6 weeks, said more than a few dozen words to Mara, but he had apparently told Clara at some point the story of how he'd once broken 3 ribs falling off a horse in a rainstorm, and she referenced this story at intervals in her conversations with Mara as if it were a piece of cultural inheritance. "Garrett says the worst thing about broken ribs is sneezing," she mentioned one evening while Mara was braiding her hair for bed. "That's probably true," Mara said. "He said he cried." Clara considered this. "I didn't think Garrett could cry." "Everyone can cry," Mara said. "Even you?" "Even me." Clara turned to look at her, insofar as a person having their hair braided can turn. "I never saw you cry." "No," Mara agreed. "You haven't." She turned Clara's head gently back. "Hold still." It was a Sunday afternoon in late January when Mara found herself, for the first time in months, without something immediately pressing to do. The noon meal was done and cleaned up. The bread for tomorrow was rising. The children were occupied, Thomas in the barn, Ada reading the book they'd brought from the cabin, the younger ones in a complicated game in the yard that involved a length of rope and rules that appeared to change every few minutes. Even Mrs. Aldine had retreated to her room, which she did sometimes on Sunday afternoons, emerging each time looking fractionally less sealed off than when she'd gone in. Mara put on her coat and walked out to the near pasture fence and stood there looking at the cattle in the cold, gray afternoon, and she did not think about anything in particular. That was rare. Her mind was usually occupied with the ongoing management of everything, the logistics, the people, the inventory of what was needed and what was not yet resolved. But standing at the fence in the cold with no immediate task and no one requiring her attention, Her mind went briefly, unusually, quiet. She heard footsteps on the frozen ground and did not turn, because she had identified them by the sound before she consciously registered what she was doing. Dawson came to stand beside her at the fence. They were quiet for a moment. That was not unusual between them. They had developed the particular comfort of two people who did not find silence between them uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of closeness that neither of them had discussed. "You should take a day," he said. She looked at him. "I have the bread rising. Mrs. Aldine can manage bread." "I'm not complaining," she said. "I'm not. I don't need a day. Everyone needs a day. I'm fine with working." "I know you are," he said. "That's not what I said." She looked back at the cattle. A heaviness that was not quite sadness settled in her chest, the kind that comes not from a specific grief, but from the long accumulation of necessary things. "I don't know what I'd do with a day," she admitted. "Whatever you did before all of this. Before all of this was a long time ago." He was quiet beside her. Not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say, but the silence of someone who was deciding whether to say something. "What did you want?" he said finally, "before you were managing everything for everyone else?" It was a question she had not been asked in so long that she did not have an answer immediately available. She had to go looking for it, the way you go looking for something in a room you haven't entered in years. "I wanted to paint," she said finally, "watercolors. I was not gifted, but I liked it." She paused. "I wanted to see more of the country. I wanted to know what was past the places I'd been." Another pause. "None of that matters now." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because I'm 31 with 6 children and no horse and no wagon and nowhere to go." "I'm not talking about going anywhere," he said. "I'm talking about wanting things." She did not have an answer for that. She turned it over and could not find one. "You think about what's next?" he said. "I try not to," she said honestly. "I think about what needs to happen today. Tomorrow at the most." He nodded. He looked out at the cattle. She had learned to read him in the way she'd learned the other sounds and rhythms of the ranch, the texture of his silences, the weight of what he left out. "This arrangement," he said, "it doesn't have to be temporary." She went still. "Mrs. Aldine is past the age where she should be managing this place alone," he continued, in the same even tone. "She won't admit it, but an operation this size needs more than one person running the household, and it needs them reliably, not just for a season." He paused. "What I'm saying is that if you wanted to stay on past the winter, the work would be here, the room would be here." She was quiet for a moment. "You're offering me a permanent position," she said carefully. "I am. You barely know me." "I know how you work," he said. "I know how you handle things when they go wrong. I know how you are with your children, and with my hands, and with Mrs. Aldine, who does not tolerate people she doesn't respect." He glanced at her. "I know enough." She looked at the cattle, at the pale winter sky, at the smoke rising from the house chimney against the gray. "I'd want a fair wage," she said. "Not reduced because I'm a woman. I've never paid anyone less because of what they are," he said. "I'd want the room for my children, indefinitely." That was already implied. "I'd want to manage the household my way when it comes to what I'm responsible for, not by committee." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close to its cousin. "That's what I've been watching you do for 6 weeks. Then we understand each other," she said. "I think we do," he said. She breathed once, slowly, the cold air clean and sharp in her lungs. "Then yes," she said. "We have an arrangement. Tom." She told Thomas that evening after the younger children were settled. He listened with the attentiveness he brought to everything she said, when she was telling him something she'd decided rather than asking his opinion. "Permanent," he said. "Yes. So we're not going back to the cabin." "There's nothing to go back to," she said gently. "And this is better." He was quiet. He sat on the edge of the bed in the way he sat when he was thinking something through, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. "Do you like it here?" he said. "Not is it better. Do you actually like it?" She thought about that honestly. "I like the work," she said. "I like having enough. I like that you can sleep without worrying." She paused. "I like that when I look at Clara's face, She looks like a 6-year-old instead of someone carrying something too heavy. Thomas nodded slowly. Is there something else? She asked. He glanced at her. He's decent, he said, meaning Dawson, in the careful way a 14-year-old, 15 now, refers to a man who is not his father and whom he is not ready to like without reservation. He is, she said. You trust him? So far, she said, because she was not going to give him false certainty. People earn trust. He's earning it. Thomas considered this. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. It was enough. It was the conversation it needed to be. February arrived, and with it a stretch of particularly vicious weather that kept the hands mostly in the barn and the bunkhouse and brought the temperature down far enough that the water in the kitchen basin developed a thin skin of ice overnight if the stove went out. The confinement brought its own kind of pressure. 8 grown men and 6 children in proximity for days at a stretch. The particular friction of people who need space and cannot have it. Mara managed this the way she managed most things, by keeping everyone occupied and fed, and by identifying the early signs of trouble before they became actual trouble. She noticed Cal, the youngest hand, the boy of 16, growing quieter than usual, which for Cal was saying something. He had always been the quietest of the group, but there was a quality to his silence during the storm stretch that was different, more withdrawn, less the natural quiet of an introverted boy, and more the silence of someone pressing something down hard. She caught him alone in the kitchen one evening when he'd come in for water. Sit down, she said. Have something to eat. I'm fine, he said. Sit down anyway, she said, in the tone that was not a question. She put bread and a piece of salt pork in front of him, and he ate it without further protest, which told her something. She sat across from him with her mending and did not push. She had learned, with Jessie and with Henry, that direct questions often produced less than waiting. My mother died in February, he said, after a while. 2 years ago. I don't know why I said that. February's a bad month for some people, she said. For a lot of reasons. He looked at his plate. He was young enough that his face did everything he was feeling, which was both a disadvantage and a kind of honesty. You got family? She asked. A brother. He's older. We don't... He stopped. He's got his own troubles. She kept her eyes on her mending. You managing? I'm always managing, he said with a shrug that was too quick. She thought about what to say and decided to say the thing she wished someone had said to her, once, which was, You don't have to always manage. You're 16. He looked at her surprised. I know that's not how it feels, she said. When you're doing it alone, it feels like managing is the only option, but you're allowed to be having a hard time. He was quiet. I'm not saying give up, she added. I'm just saying that what you're feeling is not a sign you're weak. It's a sign you're a person. She put the mending down. You need anything? You know where I am, day or night. He nodded, not with relief exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has been seen and is not sure yet how to hold that. Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock, he said. Mara's fine, she said. He went back to the bunkhouse. She picked up her mending again. The storm pressed against the windows and the stove burned steadily, and she sat in the warm kitchen and worked until the candle burned low. It was Henry who shifted first. She had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting for it, the moment when whatever he was holding inside would ease enough to let something else come through. It happened, as these things often did, without drama. Dawson was in the yard one morning during a break in the weather, working on a piece of equipment that had seized up. Some part of the mechanism that operated the barn door, requiring a particular kind of patient, methodical attention that involved a great deal of lying on the cold ground and applying force to things that did not want to move. Henry had been watching from a distance for a while, which Mara saw from the kitchen window. Then Henry walked over and crouched down beside Dawson and said something. Mara could not hear what it was. She watched Dawson look up at the boy, then say something back. Henry reached in and did something with the mechanism. Dawson watched, said something else. Henry tried again, differently, and this time it apparently worked, because Dawson sat up and tested the thing, and Henry's face from the kitchen window did something that she hadn't seen in months. He looked pleased with himself. Dawson said something to him. She could not hear this either. And Henry nodded, and they finished the job together with Henry handing things when Dawson needed them, And when they were done and came inside, Dawson went to wash up and Henry came to find Mara with the specific energy of someone who has good news. "I fixed the door mechanism," he said. "Did you?" "Dawson showed me how the gear works. It's not complicated if you know where to look." "That's usually how it is," Mara said. He had already turned to find Jesse and tell him, moving with the ease of someone who has set down a weight they've been carrying for a while without fully realizing they were carrying it. She watched him go. She thought, there it is. March came in gray and cold, but with a different quality of light. The days were perceptibly longer, and even in the worst of the cold there was something in the angle of the sun that spoke of a shift occurring somewhere that would eventually, in its own time, reach this place. She had been at Copper Ridge 4 months. She thought about that sometimes without quite knowing what to make of it. 4 months was not a long time in any absolute sense, but it was long enough that the ranch had become legible to her in a deep way. Not just the layout and the routine, but the character of it, the personality of the place, which all places had, though not all people could read it. She had come here in desperation and she had stayed because staying made sense, and somewhere in that time it had become, without her choosing a specific moment for it to happen, something more than a place she was surviving. She thought about this one evening while doing the things she had told Dawson she used to do, before everything got small. She was drawing, with a stub of pencil and the back of a worn piece of paper, the view from the kitchen window. Not skillfully. She was out of practice and had never been more than competent, even in her best years. But she sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and drew the line of the ridge against the dark sky, the shape of the barn roof, the particular way the fence posts interrupted the flat of the yard. And it was not good in any technical sense, but it was honest, and it was hers, and that was enough. She heard footsteps and looked up. Dawson came in from the cold, stamping his boots, pulling off his coat. He stopped when he saw her at the table, and then he came closer and looked at what she was doing without asking what it was. "The ridge," he said. "Yes." "It's a good ridge," he said, in the same tone he might use to say a piece of equipment was well made. Matter of fact, certain. "I'm out of practice," she said. "Doesn't look like it." He moved toward the stove for coffee, and then paused. "You should keep doing it." She looked at the drawing. "Maybe," she said. "Not maybe," he said. "Should." He poured his coffee and went back to the desk in the next room where he sometimes worked in the evenings, and she sat at the table and looked at the drawing and then looked at the dark window and the ridge against the sky, and something in her chest, something that had been compressed for a long time, not painfully but persistently, the way a thing under pressure is always aware of itself, shifted. She picked up the pencil. She kept drawing. Spring came to Copper Ridge the way it always came to that part of Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in fits and arguments with the cold. One warm day followed by 3 hard ones, the ground thawing and refreezing in a cycle that made the yard a misery of mud and ice, until sometime in April when the balance finally tipped and the cold retreated to the high places and stayed there. Mara noticed it first in the light. The kitchen window that had shown her nothing but dark and gray for months began catching real color in the mornings. The particular gold of early sun on frost, then the longer, warmer light of days that lasted past 5 o'clock, then 6. She noticed it in the children, too. They moved differently in the spring light. Even Henry, who had been the slowest to ease, had a different quality to him by April, less sealed, less like a fist held closed. The ranch expanded with the season. The cattle that had been kept close during winter were moved to the far pastures. Fences that had taken damage from the freeze needed repair. 2 new hands arrived in March, a pair of brothers from somewhere south, quiet and competent, and the bunkhouse filled back up with the sound of more voices and the kitchen scaled up again to match. Mara managed the shift without breaking stride, which she noticed Dawson notice, though he said nothing specific about it. What he said one morning in early April when she was taking inventory of the kitchen stores for the season was, "I'm going to need someone who can manage the household accounts." She looked up from the ledger she'd been using to track provisions. "You have an accountant for the ranch accounts?" "For the ranch, yes. The household runs separate. Mrs. Aldine used to manage it, but her eyes have been giving her trouble." He paused. "You're already doing most of it informally." "I know," she said. "I've noticed some things that could be run more efficiently." "Tell me." So she did. She laid out what she'd observed over 5 months. The patterns of waste, the places where the ordering could be timed better, the negotiating she thought could be done differently with the supplier in town. He listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, with full attention and without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You should have said something sooner." "You didn't ask sooner," she said. Something moved through his expression. "Fair," he said. "Add it to your responsibilities. The wage changes accordingly." She named a number. He didn't flinch. They agreed on a figure slightly higher, which she had expected, because she had learned that he always met a fair number with a fair counter. She went back to the ledger. He stayed at the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "Mara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without it being a response to her offering it. She did not make anything of it outwardly. "Yes." "You're good at this," he said. Just that. And then he was gone. She sat with the ledger open in front of her and stared at the column of figures without reading them for a moment, and then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. The thing that had been building between them was not a thing either of them had named. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in weather, not through a single signal, but through the accumulation of small ones. The way he sought her out at the end of the day with a question that was not strictly a question. The way she found herself aware of where he was in the house in the evenings, the particular sound of him at his desk or moving through the kitchen. The way conversations that started as practical, what needed doing, what the ranch required, sometimes became something else, not dramatically, not with any kind of declaration, but with a gradual unwrapping, the way cold people move closer to a fire without deciding to. He had told her over the course of winter more than she expected. Not in long confessions, he was not built for that, but in the pieces he offered when he was relaxed, late in the evening, when the day was done and the house was quiet. She had learned about the Wyoming years, the specific texture of that decade of labor before Copper Ridge, the partner he'd had who had taken his money and his horses and left him with nothing worth keeping except the stubbornness that had apparently always been his defining characteristic. She had learned about his wife. Her name had been Eleanor. She had loved music and had been the only person, according to Dawson, who could make the hands laugh before noon. And she had learned that he had not spoken about Eleanor to most people, and she understood the weight of that without making it into more than it was. She had told him things, too. More than she'd intended, in some cases. She had told him about Missouri, about the family she'd come from, about the father who'd had strong opinions about what women were suited for, about the way she'd married Evan, partly out of genuine feeling, and partly, she now understood, out of the desire to be somewhere else. She had told him about the years of accommodation, the slow erosion of something she couldn't fully name. She had told him about the note on the table, the empty floorboard, the cold stove, and she had told it without bitterness, which surprised her when she heard herself, because she thought she had more bitterness in her than apparently she did. "You're not angry at him?" Dawson said once. "I was," she said. "I spent a good portion of November being furious, and then—" She paused, thinking about how to say it accurately. "I think I used it all up. There's nothing left of it. He's just a fact of what happened." Dawson was quiet for a moment. "Some people hold on to it longer. Holding on to it costs something," she said. "I don't have the reserves for it." He had looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize. The expression of someone who is being impressed by something they didn't expect and are not quite sure how to register it. None of this was love. Or rather, it was not what she would have called love, which she associated with a feeling she'd had as a young woman, briefly, before the feeling had been replaced by the more complicated reality of living alongside someone. What was happening between her and Dawson was something that felt, if anything, more durable, something that had been built in the cold, in work, in honest conversation, in the daily evidence that a person's character was what you thought it was. She did not know what to do with it. She was not sure doing anything with it was what it required, so she let it be what it was, and paid attention to the things that needed her attention, and trusted that the future would arrive in its own time and be managed when it did. Evan Cole arrived on a Thursday in the second week of May. She knew it was him before she saw him. She heard the horse in the yard at mid-morning, an unfamiliar one, and she heard Garrett's voice saying something outside, and then she heard a voice she recognized with a jolt that was physical, a cold thing that moved down from her chest to her stomach and stayed there. She was in the kitchen. She set down the bowl she was holding carefully and stood still for a moment. Then she went to the window. He was in the yard. He had a horse she didn't recognize, and he was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, and he looked the same as she remembered, and also different in the way that people look different when you see them after a change in how you think about them. Garrett was standing near the gate, with his arms at his sides and an expression that gave nothing away, which was Garrett's natural expression in most situations, but which she recognized in this context as deliberate. Evan was looking around the yard. When he looked toward the house, she stepped back from the window. She heard the knock on the door. She heard Mrs. Aldine's voice from the back hallway. "I'll see to it." And then footsteps, and then the door, and then Mrs. Aldine's voice saying, "Can I help you?" in the tone she used for people she had not yet determined the merit of. "I'm looking for Mara Whitlock," Evan's voice said. "She's my wife. I heard she was here." There was a pause. "Wait here," Mrs. Aldine said. She came to the kitchen. She looked at Mara with the particular efficiency of her expression, not asking, not offering, simply making eye contact in a way that said, "I know what's happening, and I am waiting for your instruction." "Don't let him in," Mara said. "All right. Tell him I'll be out in a moment." Mrs. Aldine went back to the door. Mara heard her deliver this information and heard the door close, and then she stood in the kitchen and breathed twice, deliberately, and thought about what she was going to do. She was going to go out there. She was not going to do it in fear or in anger or in any state that gave him something to use. She was going to go out there as what she was, the woman who ran this household, who had rebuilt something from the wreckage he'd left her, who had made a life for her children that was better than the one he'd walked away from. And she was going to be entirely clear. She took off her apron. She put on her coat. She went out. He was standing on the porch. When she came through the door, he looked at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Something between contrition and the particular look of a man who has rehearsed what he was going to say and is waiting for his cue. "Mara," he said. "Evan," she said. A beat. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. She did not offer him anything else to work with. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. He shifted his weight. She had always known him by that. The shifting when he was uncomfortable, the restless quality of him when he hadn't landed yet on the thing he wanted to say. "I made a mistake," he said, finally. She said nothing. "I know what I did was, I was in a bad way, Mara. I couldn't see past it. I shouldn't have left the way I did." He was looking at her with the particular intensity of someone who believes sincerity is a persuasive tool. "I've been working, up in Billings. I have money now. Enough to restart, enough to get us somewhere better, somewhere with—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "I want to be very clear with you," she said, and her voice was even, which cost her something, but which she would not give up. "You left. You took the wagon and the horse and the money, and you left a note on the table, and you walked away from 6 children in October in Montana. I want you to hold that in your mind while you're talking to me." He opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," she said. "We nearly starved. Thomas, your 14-year-old son, spent 2 weeks counting firewood to figure out how long we had before we froze. I had to walk 12 miles in November cold to ask a stranger to take my children in because we had no food left and no way to get any." She looked at him steadily. "I am telling you this not because I want your guilt. I'm telling you so you understand what it is you're asking me to come back from." He had the decency, she noted, to look at the ground during this. Whether it was actual shame or the performance of it, she could not determine, and she found that it did not particularly matter. "Where are the children?" he said. "They're here. I want to see them." "That's not your decision to make," she said. "It's mine, and I'm saying no." He looked up. Something hardened behind his eyes. Not rage, not yet, but the precursor to it, the tightening she knew. "They're my children, Mara." "They are," she said. "You left them." "I came back." 7 months later, she said, "with a different horse." The anger was more visible now, which she had expected. He had always moved toward anger when other things weren't working. "You can't just— I'm their father. I have a right to—" "Oh, to what?" she said. And there was something in her voice that surprised even her. Not anger, not heat, but a kind of absolute and settled certainty, the voice of someone who has run the calculation and is not afraid of the number. To what exactly? What right do you have here, Evan? He stared at her. I have nothing against you, she said, and she meant it. But I'm not going back. The children are not going back. We have a life here that works, that is safe, that is real. I am not going to dismantle that because you decided in May that what you did in October was a mistake. Who is this man? He said, and now there was something uglier in his voice, the edge she'd heard before when he felt he was losing ground. This Hale. What is he to you? My employer, she said. And that is none of your business. It's very much my business if my wife is— I am not discussing this, she said flatly. You need to leave. I'm not leaving without seeing my children. The standoff lasted a moment. She was aware of the yard around them, of Garrett somewhere behind her, of the sound of the barn. She was also aware that she did not have the legal standing she would need if this became a real confrontation, and she was aware that Evan knew that, and the knowledge of it sat in her stomach like cold iron. Then she heard the door. Dawson came out of the house with the quiet movement of a man who is not rushing and is not uncertain about where he's going. He came to stand beside Mara, not in front of her, not behind her, but level with her, which she noticed and understood. He looked at Evan. Dawson Hale, he said. Not with hostility, just a statement. Evan looked at him. He was doing the calculation that men did in these moments, measuring, comparing, trying to determine where the leverage was. This is between me and my wife, Evan said. Your wife, Dawson said, is standing on my property, which makes it my business. Your property? Evan said it with a particular inflection, something contemptuous, something designed to imply what he imagined about the arrangement. That's right, Dawson said, without taking the bait. Evan looked at Mara. Is this what you want? To be his? Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't finish that sentence, she said. I will tell you this once more. We are not coming back. You need to leave. If you need time to accept that, take it. But take it somewhere else. Evan's jaw worked. He looked at Dawson. He looked at Mara. He looked around the yard as if expecting something to shift in his favor, and found nothing that did. I'll come back, he said, when you've had time to think. My thinking is done, she said. He mounted his horse. He looked at her once more, and she met his eyes without flinching, without softening, without offering him anything to hold on to. And then he rode out of the yard. She stood on the porch and watched until he was gone. Dawson stayed beside her. He did not say anything immediately, and she appreciated that. Are you all right? He said, after a moment. Yes, she said, and then, more honestly, ask me again in an hour. Us. The children found out because Jesse saw it from the barn. He told Thomas, and Thomas told Ada, and Ada came to find Mara with the particular look she wore when she had already processed something and was moving directly to the practical question. He was here, Ada said. Yes. What did he want? To come back, Mara said, for us to go back. Ada was quiet for a moment, 11 years old, with her dark hair and her careful eyes. Are we? No, Mara said. Ada nodded once. Okay. She started to go and then stopped. Mama, are you glad he left? It was not a question Mara had been asked before. She thought about it honestly, which was what Ada deserved. I'm glad we ended up here, she said. Whether I'm glad about the way we got here, that's harder. Ada considered this. That's fair, she said, which was something Mrs. Aldine said, and which made Mara's mouth shift toward something that was almost a smile. Go help with dinner, Mara said. Thomas was harder. He came to her that evening after the younger ones were in bed, and he did not come to her with Ada's clean practicality. He came to her with the unsettled energy of someone who has been handed something they don't know how to hold. He looked the same, Thomas said. Yes. I thought he'd look, I don't know, different. People don't always look like what they've done, she said. Thomas sat on the edge of the kitchen table, which she would ordinarily have told him not to do, but she let it go. Did he ask about us? About me? She thought about lying. She decided not to. He asked to see you. I told him no. Why? Because I'm not going to let him walk in here and use you and your brothers and sisters to try to change my mind. When you're older and you want to find him, that's your decision to make. Right now, it's mine." He looked at the floor. "I don't want to find him," he said. "I just—" He stopped. "I wanted to know if he asked." She understood that. Of course she understood that. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him at the table. She did not put her arm around him. He was 15, and that was not always welcome, but she stood close. "He asked," she said. Thomas nodded. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright in the way of someone who is refusing to let something out. "He's an idiot," Thomas said. "He made a bad choice," she said. "That's a different thing." "Not much different." She did not argue the point. She stood beside him in the kitchen until he was ready to go, and then she let him go, and she turned to the cleanup that still needed doing, and she did it. Bonk. Evan came back. She had expected it, not because she knew him to be persistent exactly, but because she knew the particular injury to a man's sense of himself when something he thought belonged to him turns out not to. He needed to try again. She had known that while he was still in the yard. He came back 9 days later, and this time he did not come alone. He had a man with him, a man in a suit who was not a lawyer but was doing his best to suggest one, with a leather folio and a way of standing that implied official authority. They came to the gate of Copper Ridge on a Tuesday morning when the hands were out on the pasture and the yard was quiet. Mara saw them from the kitchen window and felt the cold iron in her stomach again, and then she set her jaw and went to the door. "I've spoken to a man in town," Evan said. "He was trying for calm and mostly achieving it. About rights, about what I'm owed." "What you're owed," she said. "You're my wife, Mara. I have a legal—" "You abandoned your family," she said. 7 months ago. There are people in this county who know that. There are people in this town who know it." She looked at the man with the folio, who was not meeting her eyes. "Whatever he told you about rights, I suggest you consider what a county judge is going to think about a man who left his wife and 6 children with no food and no transport in October and is now back in May wanting to exert his legal standing." The man with the folio said, "Mrs. Whitlock, if we could discuss this calmly—" "I am perfectly calm," she said. "There are questions about the arrangement here, about—" "The arrangement here," Dawson said from behind her, and she had not heard him come out, "is that Mrs. Whitlock is employed on this ranch in a formal capacity and has been for 6 months. Her wages are documented, her room and board is documented. If you want to pursue this legally, my attorney is in town, and I will make him available to you to review those documents at your convenience." The man with the folio looked at Dawson. He looked at Evan. He looked at the leather folio in his hands, as if he was reconsidering its usefulness. Evan looked at Mara. "You've moved on," he said. Not accusation exactly, something more like a man understanding, finally, what he's actually looking at. "I have a life," she said, "which is what I would have had before, if things had been different." "And him?" Evan said, with a gesture toward Dawson that was not quite respectful. "That," Mara said, "is not your business, Evan. It will not be your business. What I do and who I do it with stopped being your business the morning I found your note on the table." He was quiet for a long moment. The man with the folio had taken a small step back, which was probably unconscious but was telling. "The children," Evan said. "Just tell me they're okay." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what he actually was. Not the villain, not the monster, but the man who had been overwhelmed by his own life and had made the worst possible choice and was now standing in the aftermath of it looking like someone who had only recently understood the full dimensions of what he'd done. "They're okay," she said. "They're better than okay." He nodded. He looked down. "That's good," he said. "It came out rough." I'm glad for that." She believed him. That was the complicated thing about Evan Cole. She had never stopped believing him when he was being genuine, which made it all the more difficult that the genuine parts of him had not been enough to keep him from doing what he'd done. "Goodbye, Evan," she said. He looked at her once more, and she held his gaze, and she watched him understand that this was the last time, that there was nothing here for him, that what he'd left behind had grown into something he no longer had any claim to. He turned his horse. The man with the folio followed without another word. She stood on the porch and watched them ride out through the gate and down the track until they were gone. And then she stood there another minute in the May morning, breathing the air that smelled of thawing ground and grass beginning to come back, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Dawson stayed beside her. "That's the end of it," she said. "Probably," he said. And she appreciated that he didn't make it a certainty, because certainties in this country were earned slowly. "If it's not," she said, "I'll manage." "I know you will," he said, "but you won't have to manage it alone." She looked at him. He was looking at the road where Evan had gone, his hands in his coat pockets, his face doing the thing it did when he had said something he meant, and was not going to take back and was not going to embellish. She looked at the road too. "Thank you," she said. "Not for today specifically, for all of it." "Don't thank me for things that aren't charity," he said, which was the most Dawson Hale thing she had ever heard him say. And she felt something in her chest open up that she had kept carefully closed for a very long time. The morning light lay across the yard, across the fence line and the pasture and the far ridge. The cattle were moving somewhere in the distance. From inside the house, she could hear the beginning sounds of the children waking, a door, a voice, Clara's particular pattern of footsteps crossing the floor in a hurry toward wherever she was going. Life at Copper Ridge was continuing. She went inside to start the day. The days after Evan's second visit were quieter than she expected. She had braced for some kind of echo, emotional residue, the children unsettled, her own sleep disrupted by the things she hadn't said or had said differently than she meant. But what came instead was something closer to the feeling after a long illness breaks. A particular tiredness, yes, but underneath it, the clean, unfamiliar sensation of the weight being gone. She noticed it first on the Wednesday after, when she was making the noon meal and she realized she had been humming, not deliberately, not as a performance of being fine, just the unconscious sound of a person whose mind was not occupied by anything it was bracing against. She stopped when she noticed, and then she thought about it, and then she started again. Mrs. Aldine, who was at the counter behind her doing something with a pot, said nothing, but Mara caught the slight shift in her posture, a fraction of an ease that on anyone else would have been a smile. The children moved back into their rhythms without ceremony. Thomas went out to the north fence with Pete and came back at the end of the day talking about the difference in tension between properly strung wire and wire that had been put up in a hurry. Ada rearranged the kitchen shelves in a way that made more sense, and then presented this fact to Mara as if she expected a counterargument. Jesse had apparently been asked by Dawson to help catalog the cattle numbers going into summer, which he did with the focused satisfaction of someone handed a task calibrated exactly to his temperament. Henry built something with wood scraps in the barn that he called a gate latch improvement, and that actually worked, which Pete confirmed with the expression of a man genuinely surprised by an 8-year-old's engineering instincts. Ruth organized her and Clara's portion of the room with a thoroughness that suggested she found disorder physically uncomfortable and was only now, with enough stability to act on it, doing something about it. Clara remained Clara. She informed Garrett one afternoon that she intended to learn to ride a horse by summer, which Garrett received with his customary silence, and which he apparently communicated to Dawson in some fashion, because 3 days later Mara looked out the kitchen window and saw Clara being placed, with great care and no small amount of ceremony, on the back of the most elderly and placid horse on the property, with Dawson at its head and Garrett standing nearby with his arms crossed and the expression of a man supervising something important. Mara watched for a long moment and then went back to the stove before anyone caught her watching, because some things were better witnessed quietly. She and Dawson did not talk about what he'd said on the porch the morning Evan left for the last time. Not directly. She was not sure either of them was built for that kind of direct accounting, the naming of what a thing was before it had fully resolved into its final shape. What they did instead was what they had always done. They worked, and they talked about working, and within that they said other things, sideways, the way people do when they have learned each other well enough to speak in the spaces between words. He found her one evening in late May at the kitchen table with her pencil and a fresh piece of paper. She had begun keeping a small supply of paper now, bought from town on the last supply run, which had been a deliberate decision she did not examine too closely. She had been drawing the yard again, but differently from before it, not the ridge and the fence and the barns as fixed shapes, but the yard as it was in that moment, with the horses at the near rail and the light falling at its particular late afternoon angle, and two of the hands crossing toward the bunkhouse in the background, everything slightly imprecise the way the actual world is slightly imprecise. Dawson came in and stopped behind her, and she did not cover the drawing or minimize what she was doing. That was different from March, when she would have been self-conscious about it in a way she wouldn't have admitted. Something had shifted in the interval. "That's the yard," he said. "Yes." "You got the light right." She looked at the drawing critically. "The far fence is off." "A little," he agreed. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had something in his hand, a piece of paper, folded. He set it on the table between them without comment. She looked at it. "What is that?" "Something I've been thinking about." She set her pencil down and picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a document, handwritten but carefully, in the precise way of a man who had taught himself to write legibly because it was necessary. A legal description of property. She read it through once, and then again more slowly. It was a deed amendment for a portion of Copper Ridge, the near pasture, the house parcel, the kitchen garden, and the small orchard she'd spent the last month of spring coaxing back into usefulness. The amendment added a name alongside his, her name. She folded the paper. She set it back on the table. She looked at him. "This isn't what I think it is," she said. It was not quite a question. "It is," he said. "Dawson. I've talked to my attorney," he said, in the calm way of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has resolved every counterargument before bringing it to the table. "It's clean, it's legal. It doesn't affect the ranch operations or the ranch accounts. What it does is give you something that is yours regardless of anything else. Regardless of what I do or what happens or anything." He paused. "I want you to have ground under your feet that no one can pull away." She was quiet for a moment. "This is not a small thing," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked at her with that directness she had learned to trust, the directness of a man who had decided a long time ago that he did not have the energy for anything less than the truth. "Because the ground should always have been yours," he said. "Women come out here and they work and they build things, and they don't own any of it. And when it falls apart, and it falls apart, Mara, you know how often it falls apart, they have nothing. I've seen it more times than I want to count." He looked at the deed. "I don't want that to be you. I never wanted that to be you." She picked up the paper again and looked at her name on it. There was something happening in her chest that she was not going to name immediately, because naming things immediately was how you made them into something other than what they actually were. "There are people who will talk," she said, practically. "There are already people talking," he said. "I am past the age of managing other people's opinions. And if I leave, if I take the children somewhere else someday, then that portion of the land would be yours to sell or lease or leave to your children," he said. "That's what ownership means." She looked at him for a long time. "You're a strange man," she said, finally. "I've been told," he said, without particular defensiveness. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know you do." She folded the deed carefully and held it in her hands and thought about the floor of the Missouri house, about the empty floorboard in the Whitlock cabin, about the cold morning with the note on the table and the bottomless feeling of nothing being hers. She thought about 12 miles of frozen road and 6 children and a gate she had walked through, not knowing what she'd find on the other side. She thought about ground under her feet. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the evening was coming down outside, and somewhere in the house, Clara was loudly explaining something to Ruth in the particular tone she used when she believed she had discovered something important. "I'd like to take the children to town on Saturday," Mara said. "They need new boots. Thomas's are done." "Take the wagon," he said. "Pete's not using it." "Thank you." He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down. And she picked up her pencil and went back to the drawing, and he watched without speaking. And the evening went on around them the way evenings do when people have found a way to be in the same room that does not require anything from them but their presence. June arrived with heat that surprised you after the long cold, the kind of heat that felt almost aggressive after months of fighting to stay warm, that turned the yard to dust and sent the cattle to the shade of the far trees in the afternoon, and made the kitchen work earlier and harder before the day's peak. Mara adjusted the kitchen schedule. Morning meals earlier, the heavy cooking done by midday, the evenings lighter. It was not a decision anyone asked her to make. She made it because it needed making, and she was the one who saw it. Dawson noticed. He mentioned it to her 2 days into the new schedule, in passing, on his way through the kitchen. "Works better," he said. "It's not finished," she said. "I want to shift the noon meal slightly. 15 minutes earlier means the hands aren't sitting in full sun while they eat." He stopped, looked at her. "Then do it," he said. "I'm telling you, not asking," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you I heard you." He kept going. She kept working. That was what it was between them. Not romance in the form she might have recognized from her younger years, not any kind of performance, not two people building towards something they'd decided to build. It was just the daily accumulation of two people who understood each other, who said what they meant, who did not require the other to be something other than what they were. She knew she loved him before she said it. She knew it the way she knew most real things, not through a single revelation, but through the slow recognition of what had already been true for some time. It was not the love of her 20s, which had been partly want and partly the desire to escape her father's house. This was the love of someone who had learned the hard way what it cost to choose wrongly, and who was choosing now with both eyes fully open. She told him on a Sunday evening in mid-June. She did not plan it. They were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed. They did this sometimes, in the long summer evenings, just sitting with nothing in particular to say. And the air was warm, and the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that came just before dark. And she turned and looked at him and said it. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that." He turned and looked at her. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who has been waiting for something with a patience he did not know he was exercising until the thing arrived. "I know," he said. "You knew," she said. "I hoped," he said. "That's different." She turned back to the sky. He reached over and took her hand, which was not a gesture he made easily, which she understood, and which made it mean something specific. "I love you too," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it for about 3 months." "That's longer than I thought," she said. "I'm not fast," he said. "No," she said. "But you're sure?" "Yes," he said. "That's the right word." They sat until the blue went to black and the stars came out and the night insects started up in the grass, and she did not let go of his hand. They married in September. It was not a large event. She had no interest in large events, and Dawson had even less. They drove to town on a Tuesday, she and Dawson and Thomas and Ada and the others, and they found the man authorized to perform the civil ceremony, and he performed it in his office with 2 of the ranch hands as witnesses, and Clara standing on a chair to see, and Henry forgetting to look disaffected because he was actually watching. She wore the best dress she owned, which was not particularly fine. Dawson wore his good coat, which she had brushed and pressed the evening before. They exchanged the words that were required and a few that were not. She had not planned anything to add, but when the moment came, she said, "I choose this. I want that to be clear. I choose it with everything I know about what it costs to choose wrong, and I am choosing this." He looked at her. He said, "I know. I chose it too. A while ago, before I knew if you would." "When?" she said. "The morning you walked through the gate," he said. "Not the feeling, but I knew what kind of person you were." She thought about that. A woman in November with 6 children at her back and nothing left but what she was willing to do. She had not known, that morning, what kind of person she was. She had just been moving forward because stopping was not something she could afford. "That's a heavy thing to see in a person," she said, "when they can't see it themselves." "Sometimes people need someone to hold it for them," he said, "until they can." The man performing the ceremony cleared his throat. "Are we ready to finish?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. "We are." Tut. The adjustments of married life were not smooth. She had not expected them to be. And she told Dawson this before they were married, and he had said he hadn't expected smoothness either, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. The children adjusted in their own ways and at their own speeds. Ada had already decided she approved, in the careful, deliberate fashion she brought to all her decisions, and her approval was expressed primarily through competence. She ran the household portions assigned to her with increased seriousness, as if she understood that she was now invested in something she wanted to see succeed. Jesse simply incorporated Dawson into his existing model of the world, the way Jesse incorporated most things, quietly, practically, without drama. Ruth followed Ada's lead with her own particular caution, giving full commitment only when she was satisfied it was warranted. Henry took longer, and Mara let him take as long as he needed. The shift came in October, almost exactly a year from the morning they'd woken to find Evan gone, when Henry came to find Dawson in the barn with a question about cattle. Not a practical question, though he framed it practically. She heard about it from Pete later. Henry had stood in the barn doorway for a while before he came in, and when Dawson looked up and waited, Henry had walked over and asked him something about how you knew which cattle were worth keeping and which you had to let go. Dawson had apparently answered this straight, given him a full, honest explanation of the economics and the judgment calls and the factors you weighted against each other. And then, at the end of it, Henry had said, "That's how it works with people too, isn't it? You keep the ones that make the place better." Pete said Dawson hadn't answered that immediately. He'd looked at Henry for a moment, and then he'd said, "That's right, you do." Henry had nodded and gone back to work. When Mara heard this, she said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Thomas was the most complicated, and she had known that from the beginning. He was 16 now, and the thing about 16 is that it is too old to be managed and too young to have fully decided who you are. And the presence of a man in the house who was not your father but who occupied the role in some functional sense was a thing that had to be worked out at 16's own pace and on 16's own terms. What helped was the fence line. Dawson took Thomas with him twice a week that fall to work the outer fence. Real work. The kind that required sustained effort and judgment and the ability to see what was wrong and know how to fix it. He did not offer Thomas advice he hadn't asked for. He did not reference Evan or the past in any form. He simply worked alongside the boy and expected him to keep up and told him when he'd done something well with the same brevity he used with the adult hands. Thomas came home from those days tired and with something different in his posture. Not looser exactly, but less braced, less like someone waiting for a blow. One evening in November, Thomas came in from the fence work and washed his hands and sat down to dinner and said, without looking up from his plate, "Dawson says I have a good eye for what's wrong with a fence before it becomes a problem." "He told me the same thing," Mara said. Thomas looked up. "He told you?" "Last week," she said. "He mentioned it specifically." Thomas looked at his plate again. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. It was just the one word, but she heard everything in it. The careful, slow business of a boy deciding whether to let someone in, and deciding, with the particular stubbornness he'd inherited from her, that he would. Winter came again to Copper Ridge, and this time it came to a different house. Not different in its structure. Same walls, same kitchen, same stove with the temperamental damper she now adjusted automatically without thinking, same creak in the floorboard by the door. Different in its population and its feeling. There were 7 of them now, 8, counting Mrs. Aldine, who had declined to retire despite Mara's gentle suggestion that she might want to ease up, and who showed no sign of slowing down except that she had started sitting down while she peeled vegetables, which she would not acknowledge was a concession. The kitchen was louder than it had been a year ago, which was saying something because it had never been quiet. Dinner conversation moved with the chaotic energy of a large family that had developed the shorthand of shared months and shared difficulty. Half-finished sentences that everyone understood, references that required no explanation, the simultaneous talking over of each other that happened when no one was afraid to take up space. Dawson sat at the table in the evenings and ate with them and was mostly quiet and occasionally not. And she watched him in those moments when he didn't know she was watching. The way he followed the conversation, the way his face moved when Clara said something outrageous, which was often, the way he handed things across the table without being asked, the way he was building his own knowledge of who these children were, person by person, at his own unhurried pace. She thought sometimes about the morning she had walked through his gate, the cold and the fear, and the 6 children at her back, and the absolute uncertainty of what she was walking toward. She had made that walk not because she was brave. She had not felt brave. She had felt desperate and frightened and stripped down to the pure function of doing the next necessary thing. She had made it because there was no other option that was acceptable. And she had kept walking because stopping was not something she could afford. She thought about what she would say to that woman. If she could go back to the gate and stand beside her for a moment before she walked through. She thought, keep walking. You have no idea what's on the other side of this, but keep walking. Not because the other side is perfect. It is not. It will have its own difficulties, and its own disappointments, and its own specific frictions that you cannot yet anticipate. The children will still carry their marks from this year for longer than you'd like. Dawson will drive you to exasperation at least twice a month with a stubbornness that mirrors your own in ways that are both impressive and maddening. The ranch will have hard years, and the money will be tight some seasons, and there will be decisions made badly and things that need fixing that you didn't see coming. Nothing that is real is ever free of that, but there is ground under your feet. There is food on the table. There is a man at the other end of the table who chose you with open eyes, who saw what you were in November when you could not see it yourself, and held the knowledge carefully until you were ready to take it back. There are 6 children who are, right now, more themselves than they have ever been. Louder, more difficult, more certain of their own place, which is the truest sign you know that people are safe. You're not surviving anymore. You are living. There is a difference. It took you until now to know it in your body rather than your head, to feel it as a fact rather than a hope. The difference between managing each day against everything it costs you and actually being present inside the life you've built, which is richer and stranger and more ungainly than anything you could have designed. Clara turned 7 in December. She announced this 3 weeks in advance and updated them daily on the countdown with the relentless enthusiasm of someone who considers the passage of time a personally relevant event. She wanted a cake and a song, and she wanted Garrett to be there, which Garrett received with his usual expression of mild resignation when informed, and which he honored by appearing at the kitchen table on the evening in question in his cleanest shirt, which was still not very clean, and sitting in the chair that had been designated his. Mara made the cake. Dawson had brought back sugar and dried cherries from the last trip to town, and she used both, which made it the most elaborate cake she had produced at Copper Ridge, and which Clara regarded with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had arranged this. They sang. Clara did not consider this optional. Even Thomas sang in the flat, self-conscious way of a 16-year-old who is pretending to be above it, but cannot quite manage to be entirely above it. Garrett sang in a low voice that was surprisingly on pitch for a man who gave the impression he hadn't used it much. Clara blew out the candle on the cake, one candle, because they only had the one, with the solemn focus of someone undertaking a significant task. "What did you wish for?" Henry asked. "I can't tell you. It won't come true," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has learned the rules of a thing and intends to follow them correctly. "Did you actually wish for something?" Ada said. "Yes," Clara said. "But I really can't tell you." "Was it a horse?" Jessie said. Clara looked at him. "I said I can't tell you." "So it was a horse," Jessie said. Clara looked at Mara. "Jessie," Mara said. "I'm just observing," Jessie said. Dawson cut the cake. He cut Clara's piece large, which Clara noticed immediately and nodded at, as if this was the appropriate acknowledgement of the occasion. He cut Garrett's piece large too, which Garrett also noticed and said nothing about, which was Garrett's version of gratitude. Mara took her piece and sat at the table in the middle of all of it, the noise and the warmth and the specific irreplaceable texture of these people who were her people, who had come through the same hard winter and the same uncertain road, and had arrived here, in this kitchen, in December, 7 candles worth of years into Clara's life, in 1 year and 1 month into Mara's second one. She looked at Dawson across the table. He was watching the children with the quiet attention he brought to things he valued. He looked up when he felt her looking, and their eyes met across the noise and the cake and the 7-year-old's running commentary on her own birthday. And he did that thing with his expression that was not quite a smile, but was what a smile was before it became one. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known a year ago. Not wisdom, exactly. She was suspicious of wisdom that arrived neatly packaged. Just the understanding that came from having been tested and having discovered, in the testing, what you were made of. She was made of the same things she'd always been made of. The stubbornness that had driven Evan to exasperation and had driven her through 12 miles of November cold and had kept her upright in front of a stranger's gate when everything in her wanted to sit down on the frozen ground and stop. The capacity for work that had always been there, that had been starved of room to become something good, and had found that room, finally, in someone else's kitchen with the right provisions behind her. The love for her children that had not weakened in the hard times, but had somehow been made more visible by them, like a thing that needed weather to show what it was. She was also made of things she hadn't known she had: the willingness to be seen, the capacity to let someone hold the truth about her until she was strong enough to take it back, the ability to say, "I choose this," without the word choice becoming a cage. She thought, this is not a perfect life. It is not a story where everything resolved into something clean and easy and free of residue. Henry still had bad days. Thomas was still learning to trust, which was slow, patient work that would probably continue past the point where you'd expect it to be done. She herself still sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with the old arithmetic running in her head, not out of fear, but out of habit. The deeply worn grooves of a year when the arithmetic was all that stood between her children and disaster. But she was not afraid of imperfection anymore. She had learned, the way you only learn things that cost you something, that imperfection was not the failure of a life. It was the evidence of a life actually being lived by actual people, in the actual complicated world that did not bend itself to anyone's preference for tidiness. Clara had gotten cake on her chin. Ruth, who was sitting beside her, wiped it off with a matter-of-factness that Clara accepted without interrupting her account of what she'd done at her last birthday, which had been a different kind of birthday entirely, in a different kitchen, in a different life. Mara watched her youngest daughter's face, the complete present-tense happiness of a child who is warm and full and surrounded by the people she belongs to, and she let it be what it was. Outside, the Montana winter was doing what it did. The cold was real, and the night was long, and the spring was still months away. But inside the kitchen at Copper Ridge, the cake was good, and the candle had been blown out with great ceremony, and the people at the table were, in their imperfect and particular way, home. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just needed to find her way to the place where she could feel it,